Picture two countries side by side. One sits on flat, fertile plains with easy access to rivers, ports, and open trade routes, everything a growing economy is supposed to need. The other is buried in mountains, carved by glaciers, with barely any farmland and winters that used to cut entire villages off from the outside world for months at a time. On paper, there's no contest which one should end up wealthier, and yet, tucked into some of the most unforgiving terrain in Europe, Switzerland, Austria, Liechtenstein, and parts of northern Italy and southern Germany quietly became some of the richest places on the planet. Not despite the mountains, but in some strange way, almost because of them. So how does a region built on rock, ice, and steep, unusable land end up outperforming countries with every geographic advantage handed to them? Body Part 1, How Mountains Turned Isolation into Independence. For most of European history, mountains meant one thing: isolation. The Alps made travel brutal, farming difficult, and large-scale invasion nearly impossible in many valleys. But that same isolation that kept the region poor in resources also kept it remarkably free from centuries of the wars, occupations, and shifting borders that reshaped the rest of Europe again and again. Switzerland is the clearest example. Its mountainous terrain made it exceptionally difficult to conquer and hold, and the country used that natural defense to build a policy of armed neutrality that's held since 1815. While the rest of Europe tore itself apart in 2 world wars, Switzerland stayed almost entirely untouched, its cities, infrastructure, and financial institutions left intact while much of the continent had to rebuild from rubble. That stability compounded over time in a way flatter, more exposed countries simply couldn't match. Businesses could plan decades ahead without worrying about invasion or regime change. Wealth could accumulate across generations instead of being wiped out by war. And because the terrain made large agricultural empires or industrial monocultures impossible, the region never became overly dependent on a single resource or export that could collapse the entire economy if conditions changed. The mountains also forced something else onto Alpine communities early on: self-governance. Rugged, hard-to-reach valleys couldn't easily be controlled by distant kings or empires, so many Alpine regions developed strong local governance structures centuries before democracy became standard elsewhere in Europe. Switzerland's canton system, allowing significant local autonomy, traces directly back to this same geographic reality: communities that had to govern themselves simply because no one else could effectively do it for them. Body Part 2, The financial system built on neutrality and trust. Once Alpine Europe, and Switzerland especially, had established political stability, it turned that stability into something the rest of the world would eventually pay a premium for: trust. And trust, it turns out, is one of the most valuable commodities a country can offer. Switzerland's banking system took full advantage of this. With a stable government, strict neutrality, and legal protections around financial privacy dating back to the 1930s, Switzerland became the destination of choice for people and institutions across Europe looking for somewhere safe to store wealth, especially during periods of war, political upheaval, or economic collapse elsewhere on the continent. While banks in other countries faced nationalization, currency collapses, or wartime seizure, Swiss banks largely didn't, and that reputation, once earned, became almost impossible for competitors to replicate quickly. That financial infrastructure didn't stay limited to banking. Zurich and Geneva grew into major global centers for insurance, wealth management, and international finance, industries that don't require large amounts of land or natural resources, just stability, skilled workers, and trust. Liechtenstein, despite being one of the smallest countries on Earth, built a similar model, becoming a major hub for international finance and holding companies precisely because it offered the same political and legal stability on an even smaller, more tightly controlled scale. This mattered enormously for a mountainous region, because financial services don't require flat farmland, natural resources, or ports. They require confidence. A hedge fund manager, a multinational corporation, or a wealthy family doesn't care whether a country has fertile soil, they care whether their money is safe and whether contracts will actually be honored decades later. Conclusion: Alpine Europe never had the flat farmland, ports, or natural resources that traditionally built rich economies. What it had instead was stability, protected by mountains that kept out centuries of war and invasion, and independence, built by communities that had no choice but to govern themselves. Over time, that stability turned into trust, and trust turned into some of the most powerful banking and financial centers on Earth. It's proof that wealth doesn't always come from what a country has, sometimes it comes from what a country was forced to become. Difficult terrain didn't hold Alpine Europe back, it filtered out the chaos that slowed everyone else down. If stories like this, where geography quietly explains why some places thrive, are what you're here for, subscribe. There's a lot more of the world worth understanding.